and he felt a sudden hatred for it, the dead thing that circled one-faced and tide-locked above the earth, feeling nothing. Martha was sitting at the dining table, her forearms extended along its heavy wooden top, her fingers stretched, a mug before her, her face tilted towards the steam that wisped from it, her eyes closed. He thought of how she'd sat in just that spot weeks before and spoken animatedly to a strange and dangerous man, how she'd smiled at him and laughed at things he said, a laugh calculated to please the man, to reassure him she was well disposed towards him, that she believed the things he said, the reasons he gave for doing what he did. Farouk had watched their interaction through the garden window as he'd smoked with the man's companion, a stick-thin youth of maybe 20 with blemished skin beneath his patchy beard, the marks of pimples, of acne, the scars of the threshold of manhood. She'd wanted to speak to the man in charge, to get a sense of him, to see if he had solidness, a kind of ballast to his bearing. She was doing her best, he knew, to ease her terror, so she wouldn't opt to stay, to see if they could sit it out, this strange confluence of opposing certainties, this tiny Armageddon. The thin youth had sat in silence, looking now and then from the garden through the window towards his boss and the beautiful woman to whom he was speaking, and back to the woman's husband, and he'd grin, and raise his eyebrows, and exhale the smoke of his cigarette upwards in a thin stream, and nod, smiling, in approval or reassurance, or just to be doing something to mitigate the awkwardness somehow, the stilted silence that hung between them. It was impossible to say. He had hated his wife in that moment, though he couldn't say for certain why. Because she was so able, maybe, to converse with a man so unknowable, a man whose word he knew could not be taken as truth. He felt humiliated, sitting outside his own house on a stool beneath an olive tree, nodding back and forth with an idiot, inhaling foul tobacco simply because it had been offered to him, and he'd been reluctant to appear cold or indifferent. He wasn't sure of himself. He wasn't able even to walk without considering his gait, the sureness of his step, whether his bearing seemed manly enough, whether his handshake was firm enough, without being so firm as to represent a challenge to the strangers, transmitted through their fingers and their palms. And he'd been careful to look away first once the greeting was done, and down at the ground between them. And this small act had caused a diminution in him, a terrible contraction. He wanted her to stand in front of him, and bow her head and lower her eyes, and beg for his forgiveness, for closing out the deal he'd made, for taking the envelope of money from the shelf above the stove, for counting out the notes in little piles along the table, while he sat and smoked with a gurning boy, a sap-filled, leering youth. She'd gone too far. She'd only been meant to speak to him of her fears about the boat, to ask him of its type and provenance, and the size and experience of its crew. They'd agreed she would do this without him, so she'd be free to take liberties in her interrogation. If he was present, he'd be obliged to rebuke her for speaking so volubly and insolently. They had no knowledge of the sensibilities of these people, of the way they might take things. And so he'd said to the one in charge, as they'd shaken hands in the doorway, "My wife is afraid of the crossing, of the sea. She's never sailed before. But she has researched these matters. Perhaps you might allow her some technical details of the craft, and of the course of our voyage, and of the skill of the crew, just to smooth the first part of our journey, to get us without drama to the port. You know how it is." And his mouth dried as he spoke the words, and the thick-limbed man laughed softly, and a light in his eyes danced as he said, "Of course, my friend. I know how it is." His breath caught now, as he thought of it on the moonlit staircase, as he descended slowly, as quietly as he could, towards the soft billow of his wife's blouse, where it moved in the delicately